everybody. After the very exciting inaugural session to eShe's South Asia Union Summit led by women, we now move on to our session 2 that's titled Not Repeating History Lessons from the Past for the Future, where our esteemed panelists shall discuss why South Asia needs to look objectively at its conflicted past and ensure that the trauma of our past is not repeated. I'm delighted to introduce our panel of experts. I'll introduce, we have scholar, author, and peace builder, Rita Manchanda. Hello,
Yes.
Rita ji. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
Rita Manchanda is a program advisor at the South Asia Forum for Human Rights in India. Highly relevant to this panel, she specializes in conflicts and peace building in South Asia, with particular attention to critically exploring the role of civil society, especially women's collective activism, in negotiating conflict and building peace in South Asia. Joining us today from Lahore is Salima Hashmi ji, award-winning artist, author, and peace activist. Hello, Salima ji.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Being, of course, the daughter of the legendary poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz, she has literally seen the history of conflict being made. An anti nuclear weapons activist, she served for 4 years as a professor and the dean of the National College of Arts, which is also her alma mater. Professor Hashmi, who was born in Delhi of the pre partition era, is the vice chairperson of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. Welcome, and I'm so honored to have you here. Our
Thank you.
next panelist, Dr. Ravinder Kaur, is joining us from Denmark. Hi, Dr. Ravinder. She's a historian, author of several books, and associate professor of modern South Asian studies at the University of Copenhagen. Her first book, titled Since 1947 Partition Narratives Among Punjabi Migrants of Delhi, draws attention to the government of humanitarian crisis, of displacement, the loss of home and livelihood. The fourth one, the latest one, Brand New Nation, looks at the capitalist dreams and nationalist designs of India in the 21st century. We also have today Dr. Mallika Joseph, scholar of security sector reform, senior fellow at WISCOMP, and visiting fellow at Center for Policy Research, India. Mallika was one of the 24 experts selected worldwide for the UN roster of Security Sector Reform Experts Group in 2009. She brings to the table her extensive experience as policy advisor and Asia Pacific Regional Coordinator at the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. Prior to this role, she headed the Department of National Security Studies at Central University of Jammu in Jammu and Kashmir and has also served as the Executive Director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Sri Lanka. Hello, Dr. Mallika. So happy to have you here with us.
Likewise.
I now introduce the extremely articulate Natasha Badhwar, who will be moderating this discussion. Natasha is a filmmaker, columnist, author, and of course, mother. She's an interfaith peace activist and the media team lead at Karwan Mohabbat, a people's movement from India. I now hand over to Natasha to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Ekta. It is indeed an honor to be part of this panel, to have some of the smartest women, some of the most intelligent, some of the women that you kind of you read about them and you're dying to have a conversation with them. And here we are today, all of them together on one panel, and the next 45 minutes for us to talk about our politics, our sentiments, what is it that is in our heart, and how that connects with the work that we do. Ekta spoke about South Asia's conflicted past and the need to ensure that the trauma of partition, of religious conflict, gender violence, caste oppression is not repeated. We are in 2021, and unfortunately, almost all of us are living a life that perhaps we had not imagined would be so riddled with everyday traumas, not only historical ones, but those created every day in terms of gender injustice, in terms of caste violence, in terms of interreligious conflict. That is not only seen in the public space, but also seemingly endorsed by the rulers of the countries of South Asia, seemingly endorsed by the political climate that we're living in. How is it that 60, 70 years after gaining independence, we find ourselves regressing rather than progressing? I grew up in the 80s. I was young in the 90s. And it would really, as a young media person, it was beyond my imagination to think that we wouldn't steadily keep going forward. There was a sense of disappointment that we hadn't done as well as a society as we should have done, but there was also a hope, a resolve that we would accelerate in terms of progress, in terms of social justice and political justice in our countries. And yet, in the last 20 years, across the world, not only in South Asia, we are watching a kind of a slow degeneration, a decay, a going back. The pandemic seems to have exacerbated all the problems that each of our nations and societies was somehow managing to keep undercover. Everything's kind of blown out of proportion and is visible in our faces. Our own hatred, our own tolerance for injustice, our looking away as visuals and videos of live violence, flood our social media feeds, and our seeming sense of helplessness. How did we get here? How can we get out of here? Must we resign ourselves to the fact that there are some powers outside of civil society that seem to have taken control and it's all downhill from here? Clearly not, which is why we are here together today, which is why panels like these are planned constantly. We do live in the age of disinformation, and it's very hard to really pin down what is popular sentiment. Is it that which is reflected by mainstream media? Is it that which is espoused by elected representatives, by those who make hate speech trend on our social media? Or is there still a mass of people dying to express their voice, dying to kind of push back the ethno nationalism that seems to have engulfed our times, and and bring back a sense of what we have called in India the idea of India, across the world the idea of civilization? With these questions, with these thoughts, I will open our panel to a conversation. I will start with Salima Hashmi. It's indeed an honor for all of us to have her in our presence. She is the most senior amongst us, but also in many ways so illustrious that it is an honor to hear her. Salima, throughout your life and work, you have had enormous familiarity with people who have been part of history shaping events. Even within your own country, you have seen governments come and fall. You have seen attempts to create democracy, and you have seen how far they have gone. There's been a back and forth, a constant back and forth, and yet a very vibrant civil society, a very vibrant community of artists that has kept hope, happiness, humor alive in everyday lives. You've seen how bridges have been built and destroyed again and again. What are your thoughts on the need to heal from the trauma, and what is it that will finally set us on the path of reconciliation and peace?
Well, as you said, it's been a long haul, and there have been huge ups and downs. there have been moments of immense hope, and that is actually what one holds on to, because one has lived, experienced, and sometimes engineered some of these moments of hope. And then, yes, there have been moments of great despair when it seems that everything you worked for, and in my case, yes, it was to do with democratic rights, it's been to do with social justice, political rights, rights of women and minorities, but also the right to live in peace. Because without peace, there is no question that there will be human development in our region, not just in our region, but anywhere. And that is why I think the one thing that one has kept in mind in all of these years, sometimes of sadness and sometimes of great joy, the fact that, okay, whatever happens, one must speak of peace. And hasn't been easy. And I know it's not been easy across the border also, because our detractors are determined to keep us in the straitjacket in which we will constantly be in an anxiety about combat, about conflict, about attack, and therefore feel utterly insecure. It doesn't place us in a position of wanting to work or believe in either a peace or the future. Yes, you mentioned humor. It's been a very major part of what people like myself have done, because in the 70s, we did do a program which was first for children and later it was a magazine program. It was called Such Cup. And basically, it was laughing at ourselves. And sometimes, of course, with the coming of the military government, that disappeared. But the few portions that are left, sometimes people run them, on their phones. And one is amazed at how things remain unchanged, which is, of course, depressing. But the fact that one could laugh at it then and one can continue to laugh at it now, to me, it signifies a sign that there is still life in us. I think that the fact that in the toughest of times, Lahoris in particular, because I'm special to Lahore, they make jokes of the most uproarious kind, occasionally very risque also, but it helps us lift us from that moment of despair and of feeling that there's too much darkness. Music has brought us great hope. It has also helped us reach over, uh, across borders, across lines, across ethnic divides, all manner of humiliation sometimes. And then, of course, there's literature, there's art, all of those things which really are imbued with the will to create and the will to live and the unwillingness to give up. So I think that that is something that one has seen again and again. I remember in 1986, long time ago, most people who are talking to me are probably not even born there, or they were just a twinkle in their parents' eyes. Um, I took a group of students and teachers from the National College of Arts, Lahore, to India. There was a biennale going on in Delhi. And we went by train. Don't ask how we persuaded both governments to allow us, because this was the height of Zia's dictatorship, somehow allowed us um, visas to go. So there were 40 people. And we went across, and we were going by train from Lahore to Delhi. And as we crossed over no man's land and to Atari and stopped there over the border, and some of our students, was singing and so on. And the whole railway station, together with all the battalions who were there of security and immigration and so on, was simply enchanted by the fact there were these people who lived across the Great Divide, across those great barbed wire. And they were singing the songs that they were so familiar with, which range everything from Bollywood to Punjabi folk songs. And I think that was a moment of recognition that it is possible to believe that we are the same species. and reminded us of the basic human value, which is humanism. So, yes, there have been bad times, but enough good moments to make one feel there's still possibility ahead. I have to add, it's very often women who have been the flag bearers of this, definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely. My own first visit to Pakistan was with the Women's Peace Mission,
Yes.
late 90s,
Mhm.
which which got the visas en masse for lots of us, and we managed to travel without having those city-specific visas.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic. Everywhere we went in the city, we were recognized. I was asked, "आप India से आई हैं खवातीन?" And it was the first time I'd heard that word, and I learnt it. Oh, that's what we are in Urdu.
Yeah.
And this is an experience that is repeated so often, that when there is a people to people meeting, there is so much connection, so much love, so much joy that we have to
Yeah.
exchange with each other. I'll move on to Rita Manchanda. Uh, your scholarly work is dedicated to the idea of peace. Um, you've written many times that people need to be made aware of the practical benefits and advantages of peace in South Asia, because the narrative that we are constantly being bombarded by the political forces is that it is somehow in our favor to remain at odds, to look at each other as if we are enemies. The other is going to take away something from us that we must protect. And yet, that is not the truth. It's a lose lose situation so long as there is conflict. Um, Talk to us a little bit more about it. Give us a language with which one can counter that narrative, that actually it is peace that will be beneficial for all.
Thank you
In
very much,
practical
Natasha.
terms. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I think, how does one create a counter narrative? Particularly emphasizing the benefits and what we lose by, in fact, this continuation of hostility, of conflict, of regarding the other as an enemy. And as exactly as you said, in terms of a zero sum equation, that what is our benefit will be must be their loss, and what is their benefit will have to be our loss. What are our mutual gains? Some of you may have noticed, particularly on the Indian side, an editorial that appeared in the Indian Express on food diplomacy. It actually caught my imagination. It was that we are sitting on a huge stockpile of grain, and the carrying capacity of our warehouses, the Food Corporation of India warehouses, are really collapsing under both the economic and sheer weight of this stockpile of grain. And the idea was, why is it that we cannot do food diplomacy? Why cannot we, in fact, send this food to Afghanistan? Why can we not send this food to Sri Lanka? Both countries which are at the moment in food distress for various reasons. Or why couldn't we even continue, when there is need, to send supplies to Pakistan, to send supplies to Bangladesh, to Nepal, and so forth? And I kept thinking of, what is it that we lose in terms of trade? Immediately, of course, my imagination crashed when I thought, okay, just a few weeks ago, there was the Economic Cooperation Council in Pakistan that approved the import of, I think, cotton yarn, of some other cotton yarn, and another item, and immediately the Prime Minister said blocked it because they said, um, no trade with India till the autonomy status of Kashmir is restored. Now, I don't want to go into that area right now, but just to say that we know that our trade has that all cooperation, whether it's SARC, whether it is trade, has become hostage to these kind of foreign policy questions, to these kind of very narrow way of looking at perspectives. Well, the implications of this is what we lose in terms of trade, formal trade, informal trade, and the bonanza of trade that Dubai is sitting on, because trade is routed through Dubai between India and Pakistan. I mean, we are one of the few regions where SARC is barely has something like 3 to 4% intra-regional trade. Whereas if you look at the European Union, it's 2/3 of their trade. ASEAN, it's 1/4 of their trade. But I don't want to dwell too much onto this front. It is just that these are the building blocks for, in fact, countering this narrative of hate, of zero-sum game, that we actually lose out. We know we lose out because of militarization. We know in terms of defense spending, in terms of that it is a guns butter kind of equation, that social spending gets diverted, more and more gets diverted into defense spending. But much, much more integral to this issue is the way that we talk about. I mean, in Pakistan, we talk about the deep state. We're talking about the entrenchment of the military in terms of its spread over a very, very large part of the controlling space of the Pakistan economy, of its governance, and so forth. But in India, I think it's important to recognize, no, we do not have any threat in terms of military control or military coup. But let's look at what's happened to the security sector, this huge expansion of the security sector. And what do I mean by that? The paramilitary forces, the police, the intelligence services, the amount of money that gets funneled into this track. And what are the implications of that? The implications of this is, of course, that we are living in an environment which I would describe very much as a national security pathology. The slew of anti-terror, anti-security laws that we have, it comes at a cost to what? To democracy. Why is it that today we are called an illiberal democracy? If you look at the global indexes, the global registers, India Civicus calls us unobstructed civil society space. N number of organizations, whether it's the United States Committee on International Religious Freedoms or something, we are a country of concern. We have been blacklisted as a country, democracy. We are so proud of our democracy, and yet today our institutions are at risk. But I want to just step backwards a little bit. Why is it that we are in this crisis? And I would say that it is important to look at a bit of history. And here it is that Natasha used the term ethno-nationalist competition. When you have kith and kin states, because if you look at our region, a majority in one country is a minority in the other, and which has led us to get actually implicated in the political conflicts of the other. So much so that actually we know India's involvement in Sri Lanka in terms of not supporting and funding the LTTE. There is, of course, Pakistan's involvement in Kashmir, Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan, and so forth. Now, the reason that this becomes that the domestic situation becomes a foreign policy situation, becomes an interstate security situation, is because the minority in the majoritarian society in our nation states is seen as a proxy citizen, is seen as a suspect, is seen as the other. And we know, I mean, if you look at these security laws, who is targeted in them? Disproportionately, it is the most vulnerable of communities, whether it's Dalits, whether it's Muslims. So what are we doing in terms of our democracy? When we look at Kashmir and we say, okay, that's militarization out there. that militarization out there is now come to roost at home. Those security laws that were honed in Kashmir are today the security laws that you and I live with in Delhi. So it's extremely important, I think, to recognize that why we have become an illiberal democracy has a great deal to do with the fact that we do not recognize that there is something other than conflict, that we can dream, we can imagine, and we can build concretely towards normalizing and building peace with our neighbors, and what kind of amazingly beneficial impact it would have at every level, at the level of our economy, at the level of our international standing, at the level of being able to resolve the Kashmir question, at the level of, in fact, democratic rights and the enjoyment of democratic rights, and being able to internally then resolve our contradictions with our minorities. Do I have a minute, or am I beyond it? Do I have a minute?
No, please do finish your point. Yeah.
No, I just want to jump a little bit because you see what we're because we are looking at history as well and invoking history. If you're thinking that, oh God, this is a dream trajectory, just look back to 1990s. I mean, you talked about the Vipsa bus journey to Lahore in the 1980s, 1990s. This was an amazing period of the world's conferences on women, on human rights, against racism, and so forth. Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, Nepali, Bangladeshi women were all working together. We were, in fact, interacting. The high sovereignty walls, the hostile visa regimes, they were no less. I mean, this was the time, 1990s, you can imagine, you had nuclear war clouds, but we were still meeting. This was the time of the Pak India Forum, the emergence of it, and Salima has been involved in this. I mean, the huge expansion of people driving a process, building a constituency for peace. We were co-producing the discourses. It was Pakistanis and Indians sitting together, whether it was CEDAW, whether it was the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So both internationally, domestically, interstate, we were all working together. That connect has been ruptured. And I think it's very important that you're doing these kind of interventions to try and rebuild it. Of course, it's uphill. But as Salima has said, it's not over. We're just beginning. And it's women who will lead. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rita. And thank you for taking that extra minute. I think it's very important because these things mean so much to us, because we've been so invested in this and determined to be the change that needs to be made. We really need to have these conversations as much as possible in the public space. With Ravinder, I would like to move on to what is currently a crisis in India, the citizenship issue. The question of, the Citizenship Amendment Act that was brought in 2019 and led to a spontaneous protests across the country, across communities, was something that in retrospect made us all, it reminded us all of what the notion of citizenship is, what the notion of belonging is. And you've looked at this in your book since 1947, Partition Narratives Among Punjabi Migrants of Delhi. You look at how this migrant community that came, crossed the border in such trauma, amid such violence, went overnight from being ordinary people with ordinary lives, peaceful lives, to refugees in camps, then from refugees to locals in Delhi within 50 years. There was a process of assimilation that took place and that you've studied. And contrast that with the conversation that we are having now, and even in this last week, the kind of violence that India has seen in Assam, where bona fide Indian citizens are being labeled Bangladeshi, and that is giving the state a kind of license to practice violence against them.
Okay, thank you so much. And first of all, I have to say the previous speakers, I mean, you have made such important points, which I'm going to take up as well. Uh, the first thing I want to say is that the current, crisis that you have mentioned about citizenship, it of course takes us back to 1947 and the entire ways in which partition history has shaped. So I think what I want to begin by saying is that, of course, history is not predetermined. It does not have any particular path. History is what actors want it to be. So this is so there is no particular predetermined path which is already set out for us. So what do agents of history want to happen? So I think here the history of partition, the longer term, we can clearly see how a shift has taken place. And I think Rita Manchanda and Salima Hashmi has very well mentioned that in 1990s there was this effort to build a peace movement, and at some point it ruptured, and actually it coincides with a different kind of development, namely the rise of hyper-nationalism which begins. And this also coincides the way in which one begins to remember, especially in India, what the event of partition was all about. So first, so there are two or three things, features which I would like to mention. One thing is that partition came to be seen over a period of time as something which was very unique. And indeed, it was unique in some ways, in the sense that we are speaking about a territorial division. We are speaking about the making, we are speaking about rupture. We are speaking also about the making of the modern nation states of India and Pakistan. So indeed, it is unique in that sense. But once we are done with that political part of it and we begin to unpack what exactly lay within those processes, then we witness, widespread violence. We witness sexual violence, displacement, effacement of, especially of the, people from Dalit communities or the poor people. So I think this uniqueness, the focus on that, or sometimes you encounter that there are some, actors specifically looking to to say, well, in India, what is our Holocaust or our Hiroshima, that kind of like that grand event which created a violent rupture. I think that you can see also in the ways in which there has been a push to remember or more memorialize partition as an event within the national history of India, which is essentially a history which overlooks that violence was always reciprocal, that it wasn't one community which was the primary victim and other the perpetrator, that this violence which was unfolding, that was as much, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, they were all perpetrators and all victims at the same time. And why this is important is, which leads us to the current crisis, because once you begin, aligning the history of partition with the history of, hyper-nationalism, then you have effaced, there is no honesty, that you have not honestly looked in the eye and said, well, our communities were perpetrators too, that we were not just victims. And this is important because over a period of time, the othering of Muslims in India has consistently taken place. And I would say minorities, and which basically means that the current crisis of the citizenship question has become paramount again, where it has been, in the everyday political language, that you begin to speak about Muslim residential localities as, for example, mini Pakistans. I mean, by the way, there is nothing new about it. It is already from 1990s that we can see this kind of tendency where the violence has been internalized within the nation. So here we have an entire conceptualization of minorities as the internal other. And once you come to this logic, then of course, rest of it follows easily, that they can also be disenfranchised. I think this is something tremendously important. And I think those of us who have been looking at the long-term history of partition, I think for me, especially what I have not been able to like, or all of us need to understand what precisely has taken place. So why is it that in 1990s we had such a strong, for example, Pakistan, India's people's, friendship and democracy. There was this whole organization which was working very, very actively. And as students, we were also part of some of these movements. But then came a period, it just disappeared. And we must recall in 2005, there was even something called cricket diplomacy, that visas were being, issued. And there was this exciting moment that somehow things are going to change, right? So, but something has altered, it has shifted. And therefore, and it is not at all surprising that I think just in August, a month ago, that we had this, announcement that Partition or Independence Day is going to be marked as, if I remember correctly, Partition Remember a Horror Remembrance Day or something. Sorry,
Horror, horror.
so I think it is time for historians to also take a step back and say, you know what, we need to look at these longue durée, the shifts which are taking place, and the shifts which have been taking place in the field of memory. Of course, memory has always been there. I mean, my family is a family of migrants too. So of course, that personal memory, family memory has always been there. But the shift from the private domain into the public domain and into becoming a national event, that's a shift that we need to take very, very seriously if we are to understand how this conflict continues unabated.
Thank you, thank you. So there's a lot of rewriting of history. Then there's a lot of distortion that is taking place, and a lot of us are, in our own domains, are struggling with the counter narrative, are struggling to find ways to articulately dismiss it, or to decimate it as it needs to be done. Mallika, you specialize in security sector reforms when you look at peace and conflict. What is your reading of the way in which security sector studies and war studies are taught currently? Um, what is the role that you see of this field in avoiding future conflicts or resolving current conflicts as well?
Thank you, Natasha. First off, I must apologize. Like Murphy's Law, when something has to go wrong, it has to go wrong. And I've, of all days, I've been having internet issues. But then coming back to what we are discussing today and your specific question about studying conflicts and how to prevent it, the first disclaimer I want to place before you is that my belief is that conflicts per se are not bad. Conflicts that challenge the status quo, that aim to revise and redistribute power cannot be bad. That is how human civilization has progressed. And therefore, when I mention conflict here, I particularly mean armed and violent conflict. So I have basically three points which I want to flag within this in response to your question. First is just studying conflicts would not do. What is important is the framework you adopt to analyze the conflict, and therefore you end up with the right lessons and the right learning at the end of it. For instance, if you look at the Naxalite movement, for long it was presented from a state-centric perspective, where it was seen as a purely law and order problem. Therefore, the solutions adopted by the state ranged from dedicated counter-Naxal task force to roping in the tribal themselves in the kinetic approaches to counter-Naxal violence. So once you start analyzing the conflict through a human security perspective, the multifaceted nature of the conflict is exposed, including the root causes. So in Andhra, it was primarily rooted in land ownership, unemployment, heavy reliance on the agricultural sector, unscrupulous money lenders, among others. So once the state started addressing those issues, we have seen a marked drop in the Naxalite issue. So my point again is like it's just not studying conflict, but what kind of framework are you using
to study and analyze them. The second point is that it is important that we learn the right lessons, because every conflict analysis throws up a set of lessons, but are you learning the right ones? I'll give you another example. The LTT and the fight for the Tamil Elame in Sri Lanka. There are many lessons from the conflict for various actors, not only for Sri Lanka, but South Asia and the world. So it is a story of policy gone wrong. The Sinhala chauvinism, which was the reason behind the Sinhala only policy of 1956, set in motion the resistance, the violence, the 1983 pogrom, birth of many militant outfits, including the LTT. If Sri Lanka learned the right lessons then, the war could have come to an end much earlier, but sadly, no. Then India intervened, supported and trained outfits, and eventually sent its peacekeeping troops, only to witness the LTT and the Sri Lankan government working hand in glove together to get IPKF out of the island. So once IPKF was out, the Sri Lankan government again struggled with the LTT as the outfit perfected assassination attacks against all opposing voice, be it Sinhala or Tamil moderates. And the beginning of the end of the LTT happened when it assassinated Rajiv Gandhi on Indian soil. Again, if Sri Lanka or LTT had learned the right lessons, the outcome of the conflict could have been different. Following the Sri Lankan government militarily defeating the LTT, the only takeaway that the Sri Lankan government has taken is that the supremacy and success of military and kinetic operations as a option for counterinsurgency. So that is the only lesson that Sri Lanka has taken away. So it is important that right lessons are learned instead of cherry picking the learnings that suit you. Only then can we move from reacting and countering armed and violent conflict to truly preventing them. So finally, my third point is who is learning what? And I think this comes back to the question that you had raised, like, is there a segregation in what the security agencies are learning and what civilians engaged in security studies are learning? So while on the academic side of security analysts, the civilian peace builders are exposed to more contemporary narratives of peace and conflict, within the security forces, the primary focus remains on strategy, tactics, and operation. Even security sector reform as an activity is narrowly understood as military modernization and upgradation, while in fact it is a comprehensive and integrated approach to security, where human security is the center of all of it, and all agencies and institutions of the state are responsible to securing the rights of its people through democratic and inclusive governance. So when it comes to understanding security, insecurity, security threats, and vulnerabilities, there is this huge gap of how security providers and those governing the state perceive it, and how those who are governed articulate it. So I think that's in a nutshell what I would like to say.
Thank you, Mallika. It's been amazing to hear each one of you, speak from your body of work and speak, bring such an interesting perspective to this conversation. So we can now have a very quick round of second questions, and following from Mallika about what we have to choose what we learn, and we have to be very honest about it. Rita, what you've spoken about Pakistan studies and how we block the knowledge of each other. What would be in very short your dream? What is it that you want to see in education change?
Well, I think we all recognize how important education is. The state invests a great deal of attention to education, both in terms of blocking and what it seeds. And as far as India and Pakistan are concerned, the walls the attempt is to create such high walls that there's total ignorance. I mean, there have been very few studies, but there are some studies that are looking at this sector. And of course, they're all being done abroad because you cannot do them here. And these studies show you how little we know about each other's politics, how little we know about each other's economy, about each other's society, about each other's governance system even, or the military. For that, we have to actually go abroad to look at authors who are writing all these wonderful pieces abroad. The lack, and if the simple question is one, there's very little support or funding. There are controls. I mean, we do have the UGC, that is our University Grants Commission, funds Pakistan studies in a few select universities, including in Jamia University in Delhi. But what does that consist of? It consists of international conferences and seminars that are all controlled. We know the gatekeepers. You're allowed to invite only some people. You're not allowed to invite the others. Everything is vetted. I mean, WISCOM attempted to have a session on Kashmir when the International Journal of Feminist Politics was hosted its biannual meeting in Delhi. And the South Asia University was, in fact, the host along with WISCOM. South Asia University had to withdraw. WISCOM did it entirely on its own, and where? In the Indian Social Institute, because they were denied space anywhere else. Now, and this is just on Kashmir, and nobody is even saying what we would have talked about. So the gatekeepers are all there. The walls to prevent knowledge, because otherwise we might like each other if we got to know a little better. But even on what Mallika is saying, even because Baluchistan as a conflict is so important for us, how little we know about it. We don't, I mean, you would think we would like to know what the enemy is, even within that framework, and yet we don't. Thank you.
You mentioned gatekeeping, and you also mentioned, Pakistan studies in Jamia. We have Salima with us, and I wouldn't want to finish without touching upon the revival of fairs in India. So however much gatekeeping, the institutions might try to do, the political forces might try to do, you cannot stop poetry. You cannot stop ideas from being from traveling across borders, and not just fairs. I mean, so many Pakistani poets and writers were quoted in the anti-CA movement by the students who, young students who may not even have read any of these poets academically, but popular culture has kept them alive, and how rich these ideas are that they have survived across time. Salima, how do people constantly keep sending you links to newer versions of Faiz's poetry in India?
Yes, they do. And it doesn't surprise me, really. I mean, I remember once things were really bad, which they often are, between India and Pakistan. And I was talking to my father, and I said, I'm wanting to get a visa, and I think I'll be able to go, but my friends are saying, things are really bad, you shouldn't go. So he looked at me, he smiled, and he said, when things are good, everybody goes. It's when things are bad that you have to take the initiative, and you have to go. And in fact, that is a thing. And when one has been hearing students singing, hum dekhenge, not just students but peasants and teachers and all manner of people, I go back to the time when we were singing it during Zia's period, and I remember that occasion when Iqbal Bano sang it. The hall was full, and people just would not let her stop, and she went over and over again. And the next morning at 5 o'clock, she rang me up when I was started. And she said, "Tum jaag rahi ho? Are you awake?" And she said, "मैं सारी रात नहीं सोई." I didn't sleep all night. मैं इतनी खुश थी, खुशी के मारे मुझे आज तक इतनी दाद नहीं मिली. I have never been so appreciated. And that night, apart from people taking this poem to their heart as something that expressed what they felt, it transformed the singer also. From being a mehfil ghazal singer, she became suddenly an icon of people's expression. And she recognized this. And that's how she altered the way that she sang this particular poem. She never ended any of her concerts until she died without singing this particular poem. And then there are other times when one has, taken peace missions to India. And I remember this was after the Bombay attack. And we had this poem of my father's, which is "Tum hi kaho kya karna hai." जब दुख की नदिया में हमने जीवन की नाव डाली थी, था कितना कस पल बाहों में, लहू में कितनी नारी थी, यूं लगता था दो हाथ लगे और नैया पूरी पूरम नाव पूरम पार लगी, ऐसा ना हुआ। हर धारे में कुछ अनदेखी मझधारें थी। अब तुम ही कहो क्या करना है, अब कैसे पार उतरना है. So there have been these moments in which we have to ask ourselves, because nobody is going to descend from the heavens and sort it out for us. And this is something that we've talked about just now in this section. When we talk about 1947, the thing is, the state will steal our stories. The nation state will steal our stories, because these were people's stories of loss and pain and suffering, eventually of hope also, because they had to survive. And that's why there has not been this closure, because the people's stories have not been told. The states have grabbed the narrative and have used it. That pain of millions of people has been used to make this hyper nationalism, which is unnecessary. If you're comfortable in your own skin with who you are, it doesn't matter. But this is something, and I think Faiz recognized this, and that's why he was content that because he was a man of peace, he would be loved equally on both sides of the border. In a particularly difficult time when he couldn't come back to Pakistan during Zia's period, and it was his birthday, and he happened to be in Delhi, and there was a meeting, to celebrate it, and hundreds of people. And I was told this by one of our diplomats, because he was very much persona non grata with the Zia government. But one of our young diplomats sneaked into the meeting also. He was an admirer. And he said what made me happy was that when people stood up and gave him a standing ovation, Faiz Saab said, I will carry what you are saying in my heart back to my people as a sign of your love for them. So he was certain that, that love that flowed to him had to be shared with his people. And that's precisely why Faiz's poetry is universal, and it rings true. Whenever we need him, he's by our sides. And yes, हम देखेंगे, लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे वो दिन कि जिसका वादा है.
What a brilliant note to end this absolutely invigorating session that has given us so many ideas and so many things to think about peace in the region, about how to look back and look forward, and how we can, stop going from being called these traditional South Asian societies and start maybe probably laying the roots for being called progressive societies at some point in the future. So thank you all for being here. I am so delighted and honored that you've all joined in on the South Asia Union Summit led by women. And the recording is going to be available on the social media. Our next session begins 7 minutes from now. So those who are still online, please stay tuned. And thank you to my speakers. Thank you everybody so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ekta.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.